Hello, everybody. Welcome in. Thank you so much for listening to the Strength for Your Purpose podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Phil Finemore. Can't thank you enough for all the love, support, the likes, the follows, the rates, reviews, all that good stuff. Really appreciate the support so far. Last week was episode 40. Can't believe we've done 40 episodes of this. A lot of incredible guests, a lot of incredible topics, and I hope you all have been finding as much value in it as I have. And I'm really excited about the interview that we have here today because I've learned a lot recently about this group, this organization, and they're doing a lot of great work that I know that I want to try to take advantage of the next time I have a little one, and I know my wife will too. So I'm so pleased to be joined by Leah Deragon of Bearfruits. She is the co-founder of Bearfruits and has been developing and delivering prenatal and postnatal classes and groups since 2003. Together, she and Emily Murray pioneered the community-supported parenting mission and the facilitating community model that is the Bearfruits magic. As the creative mind behind the Pollinator Parade, the Little Monsters Ball, and the Little Gnomes Winter Garden, Leah daydreamed about a permanent installation of all those features in the form of a nature camp for toddlers. And today, Baby Roots is one of Bearfruits' most popular programs. She lives with her husband, son, and daughter, and their chickens, just a hop, skip, and a jump away from Bearfruits. Leah, her parents, her grandparents, and her great-grandparents are all Mainers through and through. Same here, Leah.
Oh yeah.
my whole family of Mainers too. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
I'm so glad to be here and be talking about this really important topic.
Yes, it is a really important topic. So tell us a little bit. We got a real good sort of synopsis there of how things got going, but tell us just a little bit more about yourself and how you really kicked off this really, really unique, very important, and just so needed programming that you offer here in Southern Maine.
Great, I'd love to. So I'm approaching the 20-year mark of doing this work, which means I've kind of hit my stride in terms of that sort of magic number of like 10,000. You have to do something 10,000 times. And so we did some math recently, and I personally have sat with over 7,000 families in Southern Maine, mostly in Cumberland County, as they make the transition from not being parents to being pregnant to having a newborn through having a toddler. And so I've heard a lot of stories. But to put this into perspective, 20 years ago, there were no smartphones, there was no social media, there was no Amazon Prime. And so the context, right? Imagine being a new parent and having a baby and you don't know how to find other people, or just that ability to create community around yourself was what sparked Emily and I to start a nonprofit organization. She and I were both doulas at the time, which meant we were non-clinical support for a family. We went with them to the hospital or wherever they were giving birth. And by non-clinical support, we weren't there to listen to the baby's heart rate or check the mom's blood pressure. We were there to help the parents find their way through this experience, and maybe with information or massage or suggestions. And what we realized is that what we were doing for one family at a time, we wanted to do for the community as a whole. We wanted to create a physical location. And as a nonprofit organization, we have a mission, a model, and a message. And so tonight I was hoping to talk a little bit about that. There's a lot that we learned along the way. And the reason we were able to adaptively learn and really be in a dynamic co-creation with people who were currently living through that, we call it 1,000 days from the time you find out you're pregnant until you're exiting toddlerhood, is we would listen deeply to what families who were currently living through that experience were saying. And so we initially sort of had a preconceived idea of like, oh, they probably want guest speakers to come in and inform them. And what we started hearing some feedback of like, well, those guest speakers were really, really nice, but they were kind of in our way. We wanted to talk to each other, and we were just waiting for the guest speaker to be done so we could talk to each other. And we were like,
that's awesome.
Oh, each other. That's what you're looking for. And so Bearfruits is about creating the conditions where people going through a particularly intense and vulnerable experience can have each other and get that reality check and that perspective. And so our mission is to create those conditions. And what we have learned is meaningful conversations create meaningful connections that result in meaningful community. And so what is required for meaningful conversations is what we've been sort of studying since 2003, 2004. It's not always completely intuitive. So one of the things we observed in the early days is that if you sort of left people to their own devices, they might just hang out in a sort of surface level of conversation that mostly centered around how to position yourself as a consumer to save yourself by purchasing the right thing. Like, what diaper bag is going to prevent all this anxiety? Or is the Bob stroller going to lower my stress level? Because if it is, I should buy it, right?
Right.
And so we realized that a particular style of facilitation could help these conversations drop down into that more meaningful, vulnerable place of storytelling about what it's really like. And I think today, after the last 10 years of social media, that's pretty much a commonplace thing, and maybe even taken for granted, that telling the stories of what it's really like to parent through a pandemic or a parent through living in a country with no social safety net. Telling the truth of those stories is more commonplace now, but 15 or 20 years ago, it was unheard of. And so instead of focusing more on expert advice, we started focusing more on eliciting the wisdom of the group. And that has taken us to places we never could have predicted all those years ago.
I can only imagine, and I've got a ton of stuff jumping into my head as you talk here. But the first thing I really want to hit on, because I think it's really important, is even though some of that storytelling and connecting, air quotes, connecting is more commonplace because of smartphones and social media today. I air quoted connecting because it's probably really not connecting. And it's very easy to read a story like that someone puts on a status and type the right thing in the comment section that you're supposed to say, but not actually have a true human connection and emotion to it. And when someone is struggling with something that you aren't, and they need your support, or they're struggling with something that you are, or you need support from someone because you're struggling with something as a parent, I think having that kind of face-to-face human interaction aspect in that group setting is incredibly important. And I'm sure that's something that you've seen really help.
Absolutely. Until we got thrown the curveball of the don't gather indoors mandate of the last 18 months. So Bearfruits has been sort of Cumberland County centric. I think we have people drive an hour or more to get to us. But generally, Greater Portland. And for the first 15 years of our existence, we were right in downtown Portland in the West End by the old Mercy Hospital. And more recently, we moved to Woodford's Corner area where we actually have parking. It's a miracle that we survived the West End days. We were in a historic building, which meant you couldn't put any, it was like a brick historic, like registered historic building. So no signage, we had no parking. It was hard to find us because we were in like the side of the building. And that's on Route 77, which is a one-way street that people go really fast on. Anyway, we were there from like 2004 to 2018, and then we moved here. And one of the reasons that we moved to the particular location that we moved to is it had a fenced-in outdoor area, and we had visions of being able to serve families not just through the 9 months of a pregnancy and the first year of parenting, but to really bump that out through toddlerhood, which is up until age 36 months. So in 2018, we were like, we could move to this location that had an outdoor classroom. And little did we know, a little more than a year later, the outdoor classroom became central to our survival of the pandemic. So for 6 months out of the year, for the last 2 summers, we have done all of our classes outdoors in that outdoor classroom so that we could physically gather. And we managed to translate what we've done through our very specific facilitation style over Zoom. People are getting a little zoomed out at this point, but we're figuring it out.
Right.
But that gathering, like you mentioned, social media, it's a funny beast. It gathers us, but does it?
Right.
I think one of the ways that we use social media is as an arm of our programming, and that we put content, like, again, meaningful content, not just sort of clickbait, but like thoughtful conversations about what people are experiencing, currently, what are people going through. But there are sort of three concepts I'd love to touch on tonight. One is the concept of oxytocin, which is a hormone in our bodies. And the other is the concept of co-regulation, which has to do with your nervous system. One of the things that parents are always so interested in is, when will their child, their baby or their toddler, be good at self-regulating or self-soothing? And so we spend a lot of time talking about what is co-regulation between children and adults, but also what is co-regulation between adults, and how hard it is to actually co-regulate with your child many, many hours out of the day and night if you're not in a co-regulating community. So I'd love to touch on that a little more. And then lastly, the concept of pluralism, which is basically two conflicting things can be true at the same time. Or another way to put it is that one size doesn't fit all, and it doesn't have to. So I feel like those three ideas really inform the way we like the delivery of our message and our mission is really essential. It's very much about listening, but not just with the physical ears, but listening with the nervous system. So we're all sort of walking around with a nervous system that might be in fight, or might be in freeze, or might, and we may or may not be aware of that. And so we try to create spaces, as I talked about, creating the conditions. So our groups they generally happen in a circle. We kind of circle up around for an hour and a half, and we have some topics to cover in a particular way. And so one of the things that myself and Emily and other facilitators who work with us are super attentive to is our own nervous system state. Because we, as sort of this focal point of the circle, are sort of setting that tone. Like, if my nervous system is amped up and jacked up, nobody in the room is going to be able to calm down. But people can come into the circle in a state. But if my own nervous system is regulated, then we can do this co-regulation thing. Where another word that is used about co-regulation is entrainment. And one of my favorite examples of entrainment is if you put multiple clocks on a wall that have a swinging pendulum, those old-fashioned clocks with a swinging pendulum. At first, all the pendulums might be swinging differently, but in a matter of time, without doing anything, the pendulums start to entrain. And so that's what our nervous systems do. And so we create these circles where those nervous systems can take a big exhale, and through the storytelling, we realize, oh, I'm not crazy. I'm not broken. I don't have a child that's, exceptionally problematic. This is just this age. So, and the other thing that comes out of that is oxytocin, which is the opposite of adrenaline. Most people are completely clear on what adrenaline is and how it feels and what it does. But far fewer people have really understood oxytocin. And so everything that adrenaline is and does, oxytocin is the exact opposite. And I think when you're either in the phase of your life, I mean, the model that we're using isn't like limited only to families in, new and early parenthood. It could be used for any collection of people sharing a similar intense and vulnerable experience. I mean, this happens to be a more obvious one, but you could use it in other instances. But I think raising awareness about oxytocin and creating oxytocin informed spaces where we have to mindfully, intentionally, and purposefully bring down things that stimulate adrenaline. And by being aware of the space, like the right temperature, the right lighting, like not things that aren't annoying, people that have been welcomed and are settling their nervous systems. These things all increase the oxytocin in the room, and people need that sort of oxytocin informed conditions of like, they feel it in their body, they feel it in their nervous system. And so much of the logic about why we do anything the way we do or how we deliver our programs has to do with wanting to increase the amount of oxytocin in the world or in our communities or in our circles of people.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I as you say that, I also go back to what you said in the last kind of section we were talking about, where you're trying to create more thought-provoking conversation, right? And not letting the group sort of be at that surface level, right, where they're just talking about more of the surface level things or the material things or whatever the case might be. And I'm not sure, as I think through this, that you can actually get past that surface level thinking and conversation or willingness to branch out of that conversation without doing the two things you just mentioned, which are creating the space where the nervous system is kind of coming down or up to the level it sort of needs to be to, as you said, take this all in and in turn make sure that we're not jacked up or too low. Right. But I don't think most people that come to your classes are too low, right? I think most of them are probably where they need to be or slightly jacked up, you know, with that adrenaline. So I think the combination of things there, you know, the thought-provoking conversation, which sometimes you probably feel like you have to pull out of people a little bit, I bet sometimes, but it's probably easier to do so when you put that co-regulation and that oxytocin positive state all together, right?
It does the magic for us. Like as a facilitator, most of the work I do is in setting up the conditions for it to happen. And I think the prevalence of anxiety, I mean, even before the pandemic, general anxiety, but specifically perinatal, you know, postpartum anxiety was on our minds a lot. And Bearfruits is a non-clinical organization, so we weren't here to diagnose or treat, but more of a prevention model of, we know you're living through a acute phase of your life where you have many, many risk factors for experiencing anxiety. So what can we do through a nervous system informed lens and oxytocin informed lens to increase the odds that anxiety will stay at a more manageable level, and through the development and sustaining of relationships with other people, it will taper off and become manageable, and instead of doing, sort of spiral in the right direction instead of the wrong direction. And that has been particularly meaningful through the pandemic, is naming that elephant in the living room of, we took a time period in our lives of, new and early parenthood, which was already fraught with the conditions for a lot of anxiety, and we just poured a pandemic on it.
Right.
And then the isolation that people have been experiencing. So between the groups and the circles that we create, whether they're in our classroom or in our outdoor classroom or on Zoom, but really just getting the message out there that about what is most people have they don't have a clear picture of child development, newborn development, what's normal newborn behavior, what's normal toddler behavior. And so, I could stand up and lecture about normal newborn behavior or normal toddler behavior, or I could create a collection of questions about what's going on in your house with your newborn, what's going on in your house with your toddler. And after you've heard 8 or 9 or 10 people tell a story about our life with a newborn or our life with a toddler, I didn't have to lecture a word. They're like, oh, okay. All right. And so the craft of the questions that we ask is probably my favorite role that I have in all of this, is asking questions that are just going to elicit really interesting answers, funny answers, answers that touch a raw nerve. And, it's an invitation to share. No one is required. It's not like forced intimacy or anything like that. And some people's personality is to, you know, be light and share a funny story, and other people's personality is to tell a moving story. But it's that collection of people who are not exactly the same, which brings me to my third point of pluralism.
Yeah.
So pluralism became meaningful to me initially because we would have some people who would arrive in our classes who felt really strongly about cloth diapers, and other people, nope, that's fine, I'm good with this, you know. And other people felt very passionate about lactation and nursing, and like, you must not give your baby a bottle or not give your baby formula. And other people were like,
sure,
well, this isn't working for us, so we're moving on. And some people felt like co-sleeping and sharing a bed with your baby was just an expression of your identity and your values. And other people were like, I would never, ever, that's not safe. So we started to be like, well, how can these people who are living, you know, they live in different households with different life circumstances. How can we make sure that those issues don't, and there were more issues, there were lots of topics where it could have become polarized or divisive, but we were like, it's really important to us that these people are growing into deep community. What are the conditions that are going to allow that pluralism to not be a big deal, that we are not the same, but we don't have to sort of assimilate each other to be exactly the same. And so we started talking a lot, like, just again, the elephant in the living room, you're not all doing it the same. We don't have to all do it the same. And we might even benefit from hearing how people are doing it not the same as us. So that really had some traction to it. And people were really thankful that we were encouraging a phrase we've sort of coined around, you know, people talk about it takes a village or find your tribe. So we were more comfortable, we called it find your flock, because a flock of birds is kind of like a bird might Twitter in and chat, another bird might, it felt more semi-permeable, like it wasn't so heavy, like you could kind of come in and out. And so people have been finding their flock. And acknowledging that their flock is made up of people with different parenting styles or philosophies or values. And that's working. But more recently, pluralism has informed our so Emily and I are both white women, and we've been doing this since 2004. At that time, certainly Maine was a very white place, but Portland was still very white in 2004. Over the last 10 or 20 years, that the makeup of our community has changed. And we realized that we were only being thoughtful and sensitive and attuned and aware and affirming to some of our community, but not all of our community. And so in the last few years in particular, pluralism is a skill that we want to teach in our, you know, instead of teaching like specifically how do you swaddle your baby or how do you wear your baby, we can cover those if those questions come up. But in terms of things we might want to cover that might not be brought up by someone else, is how to successfully create a pluralistic community where not only are the people around you having a different approach to the task at hand, but they live really different lives from you. Maybe they grew up in a much more urban or a much more rural background than you had, or maybe they have a different religion than you have, or maybe their first language is different than your first language. And how to not just smile and nod and pretend that's not happening, but how to like get interested and get curious. And as a parent of children who are growing up in a very different world than the one we grew up, how to stay relevant to our child's world they're moving into. And so that's been a higher priority for us in the last few years, for sure.
I mean, my goodness, Leah, the amount that everybody, whether they have kids or are about to have kids or have a toddler or not, need everything you just said. I think you and Emily should start classes for people that don't have kids at all and just teach that, because we need it. My goodness, we need it. But another thing that really spoke to me there, in all of those things, whether you're talking about what is quote unquote normal for toddler behavior, or what is, you know, fetal development, what does development look like through the first year and things like that, and having that come from you know, from the people who are experiencing it, just like yourself as maybe a new parent. I really like that, because it provides the full range of outcomes, right? So whether we're talking about those things in particular, or whether we're talking about the pluralism that you were just speaking to, and how that helps develop a stronger community, and how that actually goes beyond how do we properly take care of this kid to how do we raise the kid, right?
Yes.
Hearing a wider range of outcomes actually gives us the norm. And I use the word norm very loosely because that's probably one of the most confusing things for parents. And I have people ask me this as a physical therapist all the time in relation to kids and whatnot. And it's, the range of normal for like crawling, walking, talking, running, hopping, skipping, jumping. I mean, all of those things are, they have a range on them of about anywhere from 6 to 10 months for the same developmental period, right? So we get really stuck on, oh, my kid should be doing this by now, or compared to that kid, what are they doing?
Right.
But when you're facilitating, when your conversations that you are facilitating at Bearfruits are less about teaching people these ranges and more about, hey, let's talk about what all of our experiences are, those ranges are going to come out, and people are going to, I feel like that's going to calm the nerves, right? Bring more of that
absolutely
oxytocin in, and dial down that nervous system a lot more than just having some, for some people, I mean, some people might like the cold hard facts of the, medicine tells us, science tells us this, but
right.
I think as a parent, you need a combination of both. Like,
absolutely. And, that sort of textbook learning is available to you. You can just Google questions you have. And I think Bearfruits became sort of set out to be that alternative to Googling everything, because you can go down some rabbit holes if you start Googling things.
Dr. Google's a dangerous place.
Yeah. So sort of taking what we had learned about supporting parents in the first year of parenthood, and what was most meaningful to them was prompted storytelling. Literally, we have prompts of, topics to speak to, from your perspective. What is this like? And what have you learned? And what's hard? And what's unexpected? And what do you wish someone had told you? Kinds of questions. And then once we have moved, we have a nature camp 6 months out of the year in the outdoor classroom. And so we expanded into the second and third year of parenting. And that's when you really start to see some, like, some children get their first tooth at 3 months, and some children get their first tooth at 13 months. They start to walk and talk at wildly different, some kids talk first, then walk, some then walk first, then talk. And so simply the act of looking around the room and seeing how people hold their newborn, or calm and soothe their newborn, or change a diaper, or all that, you could see the gears turning of like, oh, okay, yeah. It's almost more like a transmission than a teaching. And then we got out into the outdoor classroom, and people started being like, oh, 4 of these children are 15 months old, but look at, the diversity here of development. And I got really interested in a topic that's become more popular recently, around sensory integration and sensory diet and sensory input, and how some children are just hungry for more and more and more sensory input. And sometimes what we might call bad behavior or things that need correcting are actually, if you put on the goggles of looking at your child through a sensory diet of, maybe this child just needs more vigorous vestibular input with big body play. Or maybe you have a child who's sort of sensory sensitive and they need light touch games that are, like an itsy bitsy spider kind of thing. And so equipping parents with the goggles of look at your child through a sensory lens, and teaching them some games that either, some children are undersensitive and they need squishing and squeezing and rolling and bouncing to a degree that parents find hard to believe. Sometimes I'm like, no harder. And then really wrapping your mind around that sensory sensitive child who only wants to participate for 40 minutes instead of an hour because they're full. They've had enough, and really honoring that and helping parents learn, this is the child I have. This child is done after 40 minutes. And so we'll head out now. That's been my more recent project that I have been just thrilled to see those light bulbs go off of like, oh, I don't have a naughty child. I have a sensory hungry or sensory sensitive child who I can think differently about.
That's great.
That's been great. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of information in the clinical world out there about movement, and even doing that movement for a child who can't move on their own, and taking in their environment. But I think in the non-clinical world, right, those kids that don't necessarily miss the cognitive or motor milestones needed for clinical intervention, there might not be enough of that. So
all children could benefit from OTPT games.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, for sure. And I think that's true for a lot of people throughout the lifespan. That's a soapbox of mine for another podcast episode, Leah. We won't get into that now, but I think it might be even more true for kids, just because we really only have learned about that to the degree that we've learned about it, that we know about it now, within the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, the research was going on longer than that. But
I think in a more academic way, we might have known about it for the last 10 or more years, but in a more user-friendly, all parents can learn these simple ways of interacting with their children that grease the wheels around transitions and decrease the likelihood of a big upset about things, because they can make sense of their child. Like, to not be able to make sense of your child is incredibly demoralizing. And then to be empowered with some frameworks and some lenses with which you now can make sense of your child is a make or break around a happy home.
Right. For sure. No, I think you're exactly right. I think sometimes it can be a missing piece of the puzzle for some folks, especially those folks that fall in that in-between category of hitting all the milestones and nothing really to report, or the pediatrician really isn't seeing anything, versus the people who sort of clearly need that guidance and that help. There's a big range of folks in between that need some guidance and help, and probably can't get it clinically unless they take part in Bearfruits.
Right. And that was particularly on our radar through the pandemic, where you had just people staying home for a year or more, where some of these 1 and 2 year old, I mean, until they're about 2, all that sort of wildness is normal. Starting right around 2, you can start to see distinctions or differentiation in behavior. And so we were just imagining all these 2-year-olds who weren't, and their parents weren't out seeing either how normal their 2-year-old really was, even though they were having tantrums, even though they, they do, 2-year-olds do a lot of things that we are quick to pathologize that just aren't pathology. They're just normal development. However, we had parents who weren't seeing their child in a group setting where maybe the light bulb would go off of like, oh, this actually is not normal, that 9 out of 10 2-year-olds here are doing one thing and my 1 2-year-old is kind of out of sync. So being able to create those settings where you could either see how very normal something was, or you could get an indication that maybe if something warranted an intervention.
Right. Sure. No, I think that's really important. I think that's crucial for not just the kids, but the parents too, because the information out there and the way that we go about getting it, sometimes, like I said, Dr. Google can be a dangerous game to play, and we can misinform ourselves while we're trying to inform ourselves a little bit too much. So having an interactive way to take that in and learn it experientially is really important. Yeah.
And again, so much of that sort of comes in through the side door as a transmission instead of like as a teaching. Like, it's less on me to tell people, and it's more on me to create conditions where they can just make observations and inferences around
facilitate
adult behavior and child behavior.
Right. Yeah. Just facilitate it for sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. I love what you're doing, because my wife and I actually went through a program with Intermed that is called Centering Pregnancy. So that is much more of a medical model. I mean, we kind of split our time in those sessions between, because it took place of the monthly checkups, with the doctor. So a nurse practitioner was still doing individual medical checks with people, but we spent half our time doing more of like the clinical medical things that go along with being pregnant. But then we spent the other half working through like, okay, here's how your pregnancy is going to look. Okay, here's how you do these things. And it was wonderful because it was all experience and experimentally based. and we did feed off of each other, and there were thought-provoking questions and conversations, but it wasn't just the experience side of things, right? It was kind of a combination of both things. And then obviously once babies came, that was over, right? And clearly, as you know, as you've developed all this other programming through the first year and into toddlerhood, it definitely doesn't end there. And that is where experience, I think, in a lot of ways, is a little more important than clinical, because kids have so many checkups with the clinical staff, right? Like, especially through that first year, they're going to see the pediatrician quite often. So clinically, the information and the time to figure that out is going to kind of be there with experts, but trying to figure out all of these other things we've talked about tonight are a little harder to come by, I think.
What I really love about the centering pregnancy circle care model is it puts all of that information in context.
Yes.
And I think so much of what we end up feeling overwhelmed by, whether we're pregnant or we have a newborn or a toddler, is things being out of context. Like, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is that number a good number or a bad number?
Right.
And so seeing the development of a pregnancy or a new family or a new baby or a toddler in the context of say 10 other stories that are similar and different. The stories are always similar and different, and really valuing both the similarities and the differences. But most importantly, the perspective and the context that might have been lacking otherwise.
For sure. And I do definitely see value in doing something like that while pregnant, along with some of the things that you've talked about in that Bearfruits offers, because again, only part of that centering can really be about the experience, right? And the is this the normal type of thing, because the medical part is still important in centering pregnancy, right? They're trying to tie your world and the medical world that we know we need and is necessary together, which is fantastic. But having that experience and having that space to just do it through the thoughtful conversation and not make it necessarily as scientific and textbook, I think the two parallel each other so incredibly well.
Absolutely. And the clinical and the non-clinical definitely go hand in hand. Like the non-clinical support wouldn't be ever in place of clinical care, but so often in our society, all we get is the clinical care or the mechanistic, like, well, since your blood pressure is what it should be, and since your baby weighs this much, all is well, you're fine. And what if you're like, but I don't feel fine. And so sometimes that one-dimensional clinical picture just isn't sophisticated enough to make sense of the experience.
Right. So do you have families, either individual moms or families that do something like centering pregnancy as well as take advantage of the prenatal, the pregnancy based Bearfruits classes as well?
So people are they might be with a family practice, a high risk practice, an OB or a midwife, and the midwife in the hospital, midwife at home, whoever their clinical care is, that happens. That's like sort of one track. And then this augments Bearfruits.
Awesome.
The context of building, I think for such a long time, while you were, a family might be expecting a baby and they might get their clinical care. And then in addition to that, they might fill out a registry of gifts they might receive at a baby shower, and they might work on a nursery and then think, I guess we've done everything. We've gotten clinical care and we've, procured the material needs. And it was a revelation, I don't know, a decade or so ago, that like, that's only two legs of a stool, and that finding your flock or building that community or having a collection of parents going through the same developmental phases that you're going through, so you can bounce ideas off each other, text each other. Our flocks, one like definition of it is that it's a text thread that lasts 5 years. Like people meet prenatally and stay relevant in until the kids go off to kindergarten or even longer. And we've been doing this for 17, 18 years now. Some of the early Bearfruits families, the kids are graduating from high school.
Wow.
And, I think the majority of families who come through stay together definitely through that first year, likely for the first 3 years, often through the first 5 years, and sometimes even beyond.
Wow. That's incredible. Yeah. No, we just enjoyed that experience so much, but hearing the way you're programming, the focus of your your programming. I think it would augment the parts of centering that I really liked that weren't clinical, and just take them that like one step further.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic. Yeah.
Yep.
That's great. Awesome. Well, I love this. This was great. I learned a bunch. I was over here taking notes, learning a lot of things. And I know whether people listening are parents to be or not, or they have someone in their life that are going to be parents to be or not. There's some things we talked about tonight that I think anyone can use.
Absolutely.
Even just
Absolutely.
even just when we're looking at perspective that they can take back within their community, in their home, community at work, community that they're a part of. It applies to almost any area of life, but I think it's really important and something that is not commonplace in the group of people that you primarily serve at Bearfruits. So I think that's real important to get the word out on, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. So I've got 2 more questions for you, Leah, that I ask all of my guests. But before I ask you those, I want you to tell people how they can find Bearfruits. How can they learn more about it as a nonprofit? How might they be able to support it if they've just loved what they've heard on the podcast here and want to give some support? So tell us a little bit more about how they can find Bearfruits.
Okay, so our website is birthroots.org, O-R-G, because we're a nonprofit organization. It's not birthroots.com, it's birthroots.org.
Birthroots.org, got it.
Or if you need to email us, it's info@birthroots.org. We have a pretty large social media following on Facebook. It is Bearfruits Center for Community Supported Parenting. And on Instagram, it's Bearfruits Portland, Maine.
Awesome.
And so a lot of the content that I discussed tonight is shared in that setting of social media.
Yeah.
I know for many of us, as the pandemic, and not just the virus aspect of the pandemic, but the sort of social, cultural, supply chain, labor shortage experience, many important to us institutions, organizations, and small businesses have struggled. And we've all been asking ourselves the question, I want to live in a world where that little business still is there and outlives the pandemic. And so Bearfruits is a tiny organization of 3 or 4 staff members. And so every fall, sort of, around Thanksgiving time, most nonprofit organizations do some end of year fundraising, and we will be doing that as well. And one of the things that we launched last year and we'll be doing again this year that's pretty exciting is called 100 Days of Winter. And so this is a program that you can sign up for in November, and it will run from the winter solstice to the spring equinox, in the form of weekly emails with invitations to participate in things and ideas of how to sort of get through the combination of a pandemic winter with a newborn and or a toddler. Like, that's a triple whammy right there.
Holy cow.
And so in recognition that parenting a newborn and or a toddler is a big deal, doing that in the winter is also a big deal, and doing that through our second pandemic winter, we were just like, oi, we need
I need some oxytocin, Leah. I need
Yes.
some oxytocin right now.
Yes. So we got some for you in the form of 100 Days of Winter programs coming up right away. And so visiting our website, birthroots.org, is a great way to just review some of the things I've talked about tonight and stay up to date with any new programs we're offering, or things that might be changing in 2022. So that's a great place to go.
Awesome. And I will make sure I put all of that stuff, the social media handles, the email, the website, all right in the show notes. So if anyone wants to look for that, it'll be right in the show notes of the episode.
Great, thanks. I appreciate
Fantastic.
that.
Of course.
Yeah.
So the last 2 questions of the podcast here, Leah. So the first one is, what is your definition of strength?
Let's see. I think it has something to do with assuming that humans mean well and do well when they can. And whether it's someone else or yourself, if things aren't going well, I think zooming that lens out, like having the strength to not just be sort of lazy in your assumptions, but the strength to zoom, like if I'm feeling like a crappy parent, chances are I need to zoom that lens out. And then I'm like, oh, given the circumstances, I'm doing okay.
Doing okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I would want to offer that to myself as well as to anybody else. That like 10,000 foot view, or up on the, say up on the balcony view, or just open your lens a little wider.
Yeah.
The strength to remember to do that, I think.
Yeah. There's strength in giving ourselves grace, right?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. I love that. And the final question is, what is your true purpose in life?
I think it might have something to do with little gnomes and little monsters and pollinators and a nature camp in this little place called Portland, Maine, where we have gnome-sized people. They're just like under 36 inches tall, and they go out there and they pour water and dump sand and mix and work with materials, and they're not even 3 years old yet, and creating a space where that can happen and kind of keeps them busy while the adults have a chance to share what's going on. And I don't know, I just feel like the other day someone said something about the work I've been doing at Bearfruits, and I was like, nothing could stop me from doing that work.
Yeah.
Like I wake up in the morning thinking about it. I go to bed at night thinking about it.
Awesome.
From a place, not from a place of stress per se, but from a place of, what can I do next so that collectively, people who are in the phase of life that is the most physically, emotionally, hormonally demanding and requiring the most of us, are cherished and taken care of and not suffering. I mean, there's a lot about that phase of life that is hard, but that doesn't mean we don't do anything to make it a little less hard. But what I bring to that equation is that sense of like summer camp creativity, of like, how can I make this feel like summer camp? Yeah.
No, that's great. I love that. That's awesome. I love what you're doing. I hope people could go check it out and take advantage of it and learn more about the offerings and sign up for that 100 days of winter, because that's going to be, I know I am, because I've got a 2.5-year-old. So I am all about that this winter, Leah. So great. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This is a fantastic conversation. For those of you out there listening, if you found as much value out of this as I did, please be a friend and tell a friend. Share this with someone that you know that can benefit from this information, someone that you care about that could get as much out of this as you did. As always, we appreciate the 5-star rate and reviews on Apple Podcasts. It would mean so much to us. Just trying to get this information out to as many people as possible so they can have the mental, emotional, and physical strength they need to strengthen their true purpose in life. So Leah, thank you so much again. I really appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much. And thank you everyone for listening. Go make it a great week. We'll see you back here next week on the Strength for Your Purpose podcast.